Close your eyes and let your mind drift back. Not just centuries, not just millennia, but tens of thousands of years into the deep corridors of time, where the world was colder, the seas lower, and the maps we know today had not yet taken their shape. For in that age a great journey was unfolding, one of the most extraordinary in all of human history, a journey across an ocean no one had ever dared to cross before, an odyssey that would carry the first humans into the vast and uncharted lands we now call Australia. These were people unlike us, and yet the same, their lives balanced on the edge of survival, their tools chipped from stone, their shelters woven from branches and firelight, and their knowledge passed not through writing, but through memory, whispered from parent to child under the stars. But there was something within them, an unrelenting restlessness, a hunger for horizons beyond the familiar, a spirit that refused to remain still. And it was this spirit that drove them to look across the dark waters and wonder what lay beyond. No written records remain of this moment, no carved stones to tell us their names, yet the evidence speaks in fragments. Charred remains of campfires 40, even 60,000 years old, bones of megafauna hunted in strange new lands, genetic traces that whisper of an unbroken line from those earliest voyagers to the first peoples of Australia today. How did they do it? How did men, women, and children board rafts of reed, oar, bark, and push into seas they had never seen an end to, guided only by stars, currents, and courage? That question has haunted archaeologists for decades, for the crossing was no accident, no mere drifting of a lost canoe. It was deliberate, purposeful, repeated, a feat of navigation rivaling the greatest seafaring traditions that came tens of thousands of years later. And so the story of the first Australians is not merely about survival, it is about imagination and daring, about a leap into the unknown that rewrote the destiny of a continent. Yet the mystery deepens, for along with them traveled fire, tools, songs and ideas that would bind them forever to the land they discovered. And in their wake, the world itself began to change. Stay with me, because hidden in this ancient voyage is not only the key to understanding how humans conquered the oceans, but perhaps also the secret of what it means to be human at all. The world of those first voyagers was a place almost unrecognizable. To us, a planet locked within the grip of the Ice Age, where vast glaciers held the north in chains of frozen white, and the oceans lay lower, exposing lands that no longer exist on today's maps. A prehistoric geography that shaped the path humans would take into the unknown. Imagine a single supercontinent of islands and peninsulas stretching from Southeast Asia into the waters of the Pacific, a region scientists now call Sahul, where Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania formed one great landmass. And just to the west lay Sunda, a realm that included much of modern Indonesia. Between Sunda and Sahul stretched deep channels of ocean, blue and endless, that even at the lowest sea levels formed barriers no human had yet attempted to breach. And yet, scattered across the evidence left behind, there are signs that people were gathering knowledge, adapting, preparing for something extraordinary. They crafted tools of flint and volcanic glass. They learned to weave and bind reeds. They grew skilled at fire, and their social groups expanded beyond isolated families into clans that could share labor, memory, and innovation. Food was plentiful, but unpredictable, for this was an age of shifting climates and sudden droughts, when the great herds could vanish overnight, when forests burned and rivers dried, when hunger could turn safety into peril. And in such moments, the need to move, to search, to risk became irresistible. But how could they have even thought of crossing? That is the enigma that grips us. For the sea was not merely a physical barrier, it was a psychological one, a vast unknown that devoured the horizon. Yet, perhaps hunger pushed them, or perhaps curiosity, or perhaps a combination of both, a primal urge hardwired into our species that has always driven us toward new frontiers. Archaeologists find clues in caves and riverbanks, flakes of stone shaped with precision, pigments smeared on rock long before written language, remnants of shelters that hint at gatherings, rituals, and storytelling. These were not primitive wanderers stumbling blindly. These were people capable of planning, foresight, and imagination, able to look at a problem, whether it was hunting a mammoth, surviving a drought, or facing the endless ocean, and say, there must be a way. And here lies the turning point. For without that mindset, the story of humanity would have stopped where the land ended. And yet it did not. Instead, somewhere in the dense forests of Sunda, groups began to test the waters, lashing together, bamboo and reeds, pushing rafts onto rivers, learning how currents carried them, how balance could be maintained, how stars shifted with the seasons. It may have taken generations, centuries even, of trial and error, but the knowledge accumulated passed quietly from elder to youth, until one day the thought no longer seemed impossible. The sea could be crossed. This was the stage upon which the greatest migration of its age was set, a silent decision taken by people whose names are lost to time, yet whose courage still lingers in the DNA of millions alive today. And as the winds howled across the Ice Age savannas, and the fires flickered against the walls of their shelters, they prepared themselves, though they could not yet know that the moment they set their rafts upon the waves, they would change not only their own fate, but the fate of a continent forever. Stay with this thought, because the journey they undertook was not a single crossing, not a lucky accident, but a deliberate path carved into human history, a feat that would echo across tens of thousands of years. And the deeper we follow their trail, the stranger and more awe-inspiring it becomes. When the moment came to leave the safety of familiar shores, the ocean must have seemed like a living force, an endless expanse that swallowed the horizon in shifting shades of blue and black, its surface glittering by day under a merciless sun, and glowing by night beneath a canopy of stars. And into this daunting abyss the first voyagers pushed their fragile vessels, lashed together from bamboo, bark, reeds, or hollowed logs, bound by resin and rope woven from plant fibers, primitive in appearance but ingenious in design, for they were buoyant, flexible, and capable of carrying families, tools, fire, and the essentials of survival. It was not one raft, not one family, not one accidental drift that began this saga. It was a series of deliberate crossings, repeated over time, each one an act of courage, each one building upon the lessons of those who dared before, until the sea itself became not only an obstacle, but also a highway, a bridge that connected two worlds. But what drove them into the waves? Some believe famine gnawed at their bellies as prey animals dwindled in the old lands. Others that storms and changing climates pushed them outward, while still others suggest something deeper, a restless spirit within our species that has always compelled us to move, to explore, to expand into the unknown. Whatever the reason, as they set out into the vastness, they carried with them more than bodies and supplies. They carried memory, culture, language, and song, the invisible threads that bound them together and gave them strength when the ocean raged against their fragile craft. The crossing was no simple drift. It required knowledge of currents, winds, tides, and stars. Knowledge accumulated through generations of watching rivers flow, of noticing how flotsam always washed up on certain beaches, of reading the sky for patterns that repeated with the seasons. Imagine nights when the voyagers huddled close, the fire glowing faintly within a pit of stones to keep embers alive, the stars wheeling overhead as an elder pointed to constellations and said, "Follow this path." Their voices nearly drowned by the crashing waves. Some would not survive, rafts would sink, storms would tear them apart, families would vanish into the deep, and yet others would succeed, proving it could be done, showing that across the horizon lay not death, but new life, new land, new hope. Archaeologists and scientists today reconstruct this daring by building replicas of these ancient vessels, testing whether the journey was possible, and time after time the results prove what the ancestors already knew. Humans, 50,000 or more, years ago were capable of organized, intentional ocean travel, a feat that rivals the Polynesian voyages of much later times. Yet within this triumph lies a haunting thought. How many were lost? How many voices, songs and stories were swallowed by the sea, never to be heard again? The ocean crossing to Sahul was not a single event. It was a flood of journeys, layer upon layer, until slowly, steadily, a population grew upon a land no human had ever set foot on before. With every successful crossing, the map of the world expanded in human minds, and the impossible became possible. But still, mysteries remain. Did they first land in the north, near New Guinea, or along the Kimberley coast? Did they follow island chains or strike boldly across open water. The evidence is scattered, incomplete, a puzzle with missing pieces. Yet what we know is enough to glimpse the courage of those moments, the silence before dawn as rafts were pushed into the surf, the cries of children, the pounding of waves, the salt-stinging eyes as men and women leaned into paddles, driven by something greater than fear, the unshakable belief that somewhere beyond the horizon, a new world waited. Hold on to that image, because the land they discovered was not an empty wilderness, but a realm filled with creatures that had never seen humans before. A place that would test their resilience, imagination, and unity in ways the ocean never could. And it is in that meeting of human and land where the story takes an even more astonishing turn. At last, after days, perhaps weeks, of pushing through waves, salt spray biting at their lips, skin cracked by sun and wind, the voyagers saw it, the hazy outline of land shimmering on the horizon, a line of deep green rising from the endless blue, and as their raft scraped against the unfamiliar shores, the first footprints of humanity pressed into the sands of a continent that had never known our kind before. A moment so monumental and yet so silent. No drumbeats, no declarations, only the breathless awe of men, women, and children stepping into a place that would transform them as much as they would transform it. Before them stretched forests unlike any they had known. Groves of towering eucalyptus trees filling the air with sharp scents. Grasslands stretching to the horizon, and rivers teeming with fish whose shapes were alien to their eyes. Yet it was not only plants and waters that awaited them, for the land pulsed with giants. Megafauna so massive and strange, they seemed like creatures of legend. Kangaroos twice the height of a man bounding across open plains. Wombats the size of cars lumbering slowly through scrubland. Flightless, birds taller than warriors. And lurking in swamps and rivers, monstrous lizards and crocodiles that could drag an adult beneath the surface in an instant. Imagine their fear and wonder as they first encountered these beasts. Creatures that had evolved in isolation for millions of years without ever facing the cunning of human hunters. Creatures that did not yet fear the two-legged newcomers. The first Australians, however, carried with them fire and stone, spears hardened in flame, axes chipped sharp, and the patience of hunters who had followed game across continents. And slowly, carefully, they began to learn the rhythms of this strange new land. Nights were filled with the crackle of fires as stories were born, tales of the giants, warnings passed from mouth to ear about the dangerous waters where crocodiles lurked, or the cliffs where giant eagles soared. Their survival depended not only on strength, but on memory, for every mistake was costly. Every wrong step into the jaws of a predator could erase an entire family line, and so knowledge became sacred, a treasure shared in song and story, repeated so often that even children carried the wisdom of the land in their minds. Yet alongside the danger lay abundance, for rivers yielded fish and shellfish, plains yielded kangaroos and wallabies, and seeds, roots, and fruits were gathered in patterns guided by the seasons. Fire became their tool, not only for warmth and cooking, but for shaping the very land itself, burning grasslands to drive game, clearing forests to encourage new growth, weaving themselves into the ecological fabric in ways no creature had before. Slowly, the land began to change under their touch. The giants of megafauna retreating, their numbers dwindling, perhaps hunted, perhaps pressured by a changing climate, until silence fell where once there had been thunderous herds. But even as some creatures vanished, others endured, and the bond between human and land grew ever deeper, so that survival was no longer a daily gamble, but a way of life, a rhythm as steady as the tides that had carried them here. This was not a barren wilderness, as outsiders once believed. It was a place of abundance, a place alive with stories, spirits, and connections so profound they would echo for tens of thousands of years. For the first peoples were not mere survivors. They became custodians, shaping and shaped by the land in a mutual embrace. Yet the full mystery remains. How quickly did they spread across this vast continent, from the rainforests of the north to the deserts of the interior, from the coasts to the mountains, until within a few thousand years, every corner of Australia bore the mark of human presence. The evidence lies in campsites, in rock shelters, in handprints stenciled on stone walls, voices reaching out from 40,000 years ago to say, "We were here, we thrived, we belonged." But the journey was not over, for the challenges of this new world demanded more than survival. They demanded imagination, adaptation, and a relationship with the land unlike anything humanity had ever known. And in those bonds lies one of the greatest untold stories of human history. As generations passed, the first Australians did more than merely survive. They wove themselves into the very soul of the continent, creating a culture so deeply bound to the rhythms of land, sky, and water that it endured for tens of thousands of years. One of the longest continuous traditions in human history. And at the heart of this achievement lay the power of story, of song, of memory carried across centuries without the need for writing or monuments. For their map of the world was not drawn on paper, but sung into existence through what would later be called songlines, intricate oral pathways that crisscrossed the land, each one a chain of verses describing landmarks, rivers, hills, and sacred sites, so that by knowing the song, one could walk across hundreds of kilometers without ever being lost, guided not by compass or star charts, but by the melody of the earth itself. These songlines were more than navigation. They were lifelines, binding people to ancestors and to the dreaming. The vast tapestry of creation stories that explained not only how the land came to be, but how humans were to live upon it. And in this way, every rock, every waterhole, every tree became part of a living library, carrying meaning and responsibility. For to forget the songs was to sever the chain that connected people to both past and future. Around fires, under vast skies blazing with stars, elders told stories of how spirits had shaped rivers with their movements, how mountains had risen from the footsteps of giants, how animals had taught humans the ways of hunting and survival. And these were not seen as myths in the way modern minds often dismiss them, but as truth, layered and eternal. Truth that guided law, morality, and identity. Alongside these stories came fire, not just as a tool of warmth and cooking, but as an instrument of ecological artistry. For controlled burning of grasslands encouraged new growth, brought animals to graze, reduced dangerous wildfires, and kept the land open and fertile. And this practice, carried out for thousands upon thousands of years, would later be recognized as one of the most sophisticated land management systems in human history. With every generation, knowledge deepened of which plants healed wounds, which roots quenched thirst in deserts, which stars signaled the coming of rains. And this knowledge was shared, repeated, sung, so that even the youngest carried an inheritance of wisdom as rich as any library. Yet within this cultural flowering, there was also resilience against hardship, for the land was harsh and the climate unpredictable, demanding not only patience but ingenuity. And when drought struck or rivers shrank, people turned to their stories and their songlines for guidance, for within them lay instructions on how to endure, where to find waterholes, when to move, and where to stay. The bond was so complete that to harm the land was to harm oneself, for they did not see themselves as separate from nature, but as one thread in its vast web, entrusted with responsibility rather than ownership. And this worldview shaped behaviors, ceremonies, and identities that endured even as ice ages came and went, as seas rose and drowned the coasts they had first walked upon. Rock art began to flourish, pigments pressed against stone walls, figures of humans, animals, and spirits painted in ochre and charcoal, each one a window into the way they saw the world. And in these paintings we glimpse not only daily life, hunts, dances, rituals, but also visions of the dreaming, timeless stories etched into stone as reminders that culture, land, and spirit were indivisible. And so the first Australians became not wanderers lost in an alien wilderness, but masters of place, custodians of a world that others would one day call harsh, but that they knew as generous, abundant, alive. For tens of thousands of years, long before pyramids rose or cities formed, they sustained one of humanity's most profound relationships with land, proving that survival need not mean conquest, that endurance can come not through domination, but through harmony, and this harmony would echo on, surviving storms of change that had yet to come. Still, questions remain. How far did these songlines reach? How many stories have been lost to time? And how much of this ancient wisdom still whispers through the land today, waiting for us to listen? Time rolled forward in its relentless tide, and as the world shifted, so too did the lives of the first Australians. For the ice that had locked seas into frozen walls began to melt, releasing waters that crept inland, swallowing the coasts where the first voyagers had landed, drowning valleys, severing land bridges, and reshaping the very outline of the continent. Yet even as oceans rose and familiar places vanished beneath the waves, the people endured, carrying with them the memory of what had been lost. For in their stories and songs are echoes of landscapes now hidden beneath the sea, accounts of rivers that once flowed where the seabed now lies, of hunting grounds that no longer exist, of journeys to islands that are now isolated by deep water, testimony that oral traditions are not fragile whispers, but enduring vaults of history stretching back tens of millennia. This resilience in the face of dramatic change speaks to a mastery of adaptation. For when resources shifted, so did strategies. Coastal groups turned increasingly to fish traps, nets, and shellfish harvests. Inland groups deepened their knowledge of roots, tubers, and seeds. And fire remained the sculptor of ecosystems, ensuring that life thrived even as climates transformed. Communities expanded across deserts, rainforests, mountains, and coasts, each shaping their traditions to the unique challenges of their homeland, while remaining bound by the unifying web of songlines and dreaming. From Arnhem Land to the Kimberley, from the Red Centre to Tasmania, before it was cut off by rising seas, art, ceremony, and ritual flourished. Some painted in ochre across sacred rock shelters, some etched into stone, others performed in song, and dance that reverberated through generations, all carrying forward the wisdom that survival was never simply about food or water, but about connection to ancestors, to land, to the great cycle of life. Archaeological traces of this life still surface. Stone tools carefully shaped from quarries used for thousands of years, grindstones stained with ochre or seeds, fish traps so ingeniously designed they remain functional even after millennia, and caves adorned with art that tells of spirits, animals, hunts, and visions. And while other parts of the world shifted toward agriculture, ploughs, and cities, the first Australians sustained a system equally sophisticated, one rooted not in walls and monuments, but in balance, in managing ecosystems so they continue to provide for countless generations, a way of life so enduring that it became the longest continuous cultural tradition on Earth. Yet endurance did not mean stagnation. Knowledge evolved, tools were refined, social systems grew complex, alliances and boundaries were maintained, and the spiritual fabric deepened with every retelling of dreaming stories, creating a living culture that was not frozen in time, but ever adaptive, ever alive. Even as megafauna disappeared and the climate became harsher, communities adjusted, proving that survival required not just courage in a single crossing, but constant resilience across millennia. And though the world outside would one day change, in ways they could not foresee, ships arriving from distant continents, empires seeking conquest, landscapes disrupted by foreign hands, the truth remains that for tens of thousands of years before such contact, Australia was a place where humans thrived, not by bending the land to their will, but by listening to its voice, shaping a civilization unlike any other, built not from stone towers, but from story, song, fire, and memory. That legacy still flows today, carried in the traditions, knowledge, and identity of Indigenous Australians, whose voices remain the living continuation of the Great Crossing, the proof that the journey begun across ancient seas did not end on the shore but continues in unbroken line to the present, a line older than the pyramids, older than Mesopotamia, older than history itself. And here lies the mystery that binds us to them. How much of their endurance can teach us now, in an age of upheaval and climate shifts, what it means to adapt, to to live with the land rather than against it, to sustain ourselves not for decades or centuries, but for ages. Their story is not just their own, it is humanity's, for it reminds us that the same daring that once pushed small bands of voyagers onto rafts toward an unknown horizon is still within us, and that perhaps, to understand our future, we must first honor the wisdom of those who walked into Australia tens of thousands of years ago and never stopped walking. And so, as we close this journey into the depths of prehistory, let us linger on the image of a small band of humans silhouetted against the rising sun, pushing their fragile rafts into waters that stretched farther than their eyes could see, carrying with them not just tools and fire, but stories, courage, and the seed of a culture that would become the longest continuous thread of human life on Earth. Their voyage was not a single act of chance, but the first chapter of an epic of resilience, one that spanned tens of thousands of years as the seas rose, the climate shifted, and the land itself changed beneath their feet. Yet still, they endured, adapting, thriving, and building a civilization woven from songlines and dreaming, from fire and art, from memory and land. In their story lies a reminder that survival is never simply about conquest or control, but about balance, patience, and connection to forces larger than ourselves. The crossing into Australia was more than a migration. It was a declaration of what it means to be human, to look beyond fear into uncertainty, to embrace the unknown with trust in each other and in the wisdom of ancestors. Even now, in an age of satellites and skyscrapers, their lesson remains that the most enduring journeys are not written in stone, but sung in spirit, passed through generations, not by monuments, but by living voices, still alive today in the first peoples of Australia, who carry within them the unbroken flame of that first daring leap. Their story is humanity's story, and if we listen closely, it tells us that the greatest voyages are not simply across oceans of water, but across oceans of time, where courage and memory guide us still.